Augustine of Hippo Regius, 354-430 AD. St. Augustine of Hippo is central to the development of Western philosophy. His books had a profound influence on the medieval worldview. In other words, what Augustine thought and wrote influenced the way in which the people during this time perceived themselves and their place in the world. He also contributed greatly to the spread of Christianity throughout the Western world. Augustine was born into a family where his father was a pagan and practiced the traditional pagan religion. His mother, however, was a Christian and spent all of her life praying that Augustine would also convert to Christianity and adopt that as the true religion. However, Augustine had his own ideas, and as a youth, he followed the Manichaean religion. While he was in school, he also adopted the philosophy of most of the young men he was with, that life was full of pleasures that were meant to be enjoyed, and that he should enjoy as many women, have as much fun, drink as much wine, and find all the pleasures he could, and be sure to tell everyone about it. It's during this time he famously uttered the prayer, "God, grant me chastity and temperance, but not yet." After he finished school, he moved to Italy and for a while was teaching grammar in a school in Rome, but eventually moved to northern Italy in Milan. Augustine was still teaching in Milan, but he also began studying the ideas of the Neoplatonists and began attending the lectures and reading the works of Ambrose, the great Christian theologian and philosopher. After a few years, he ultimately converted to Christianity and asked to be baptized, and was baptized and entered into the Christian church in the year 387. Shortly after that, he returned to Africa, the area of Hippo Regius, which is near modern-day Algeria, and he remained there most of his life. Augustine's two most famous and influential books were Confessions and The City of God. He wrote the Confessions and published it between the years of 397 and 398 when he was in his 40s. At this time, Augustine felt a need to come to terms with his wild and profligate youth, and in his Confessions he describes in great detail the follies and errors of his ways during his boyhood and his youth while he was in school and up to the time that he was converted to Christianity. The City of God in 426 was written as a response to the decline of the Roman Empire. In the City of God, he argues that the decline and disintegration of the Roman Empire was inevitable due to the continued pagan practices of the people and the arrogance of the Roman emperors who declared themselves divine. Augustine argues that Christians need to be more concerned with the city of God rather than a city of man, and that the Roman Empire represents the city of man, that all things on earth are temporal and will ultimately come to an end, whereas spiritual ideals are eternal and more lasting. And he argues that the Catholic Church is representative of a spiritual city of God, quite distinct from the earthly city, and can serve as a model for what man should be following. A number of the tenets of Augustinian thought led to the following doctrines, which formulated the basis or the foundation of the Catholic Church at the time. Augustine formulated the doctrines of inner illumination, just war, natural knowledge, original sin, and free will. The doctrine of inner illumination. This doctrine is based on the Platonic ideal of different levels of knowledge and understanding, and also Plato's idea that anyone is capable of reaching illumination and understanding. And Augustine argues as well that all men were given a rational mind, or the gift of reason, and therefore all men are able to obtain illumination and understanding. That God plays a part in human perception and understanding by illuminating the mind to recognize the intelligible realities that God presents. In other words, simply by our existence and our perception, we are able to recognize that God does indeed exist. Just war. Now, Augustine argued that Christians, as a rule, should be pacifists and lead lives of peace and seek peace at all times. However, sometimes that is not possible, and that peacefulness in the face of a grave wrong that can only be stopped by violence would be a sin, and that sometimes the defense of oneself or others can be a necessity. So the doctrine of just war argues that in the face of annihilation or in the face of evil, sometimes Christians must act in violent ways, and sometimes war is inevitable. Biblical interpretation and natural knowledge. The Bible cannot always be interpreted as literal, says Augustine, that some things in the Bible contradict what we know to be illogical and against natural law. In these instances, the biblical text cannot be interpreted as being literal, but instead as metaphorical. And we interpret it this way if it contradicts what we know from science and our God-given reason to be impossible. So, for example, the creation of the world in 7 days. That is not meant for us to believe that God created the world in a literal 7 days. That may be, it may not. The point is that the 7 days give us a context in which to understand the creation of the world and the order in which the world and all that is in it was created. And therefore we should look at it as a metaphor that is telling us a higher truth. That Scripture does have a literal sense, but it doesn't mean that Scriptures are mere history. At times the Scriptures are extended metaphors. So for example, again, that God created the earth in 7 days. That is not a historical reference, that is a metaphoric reference, and we should understand it as such. Also, Christians are saved if and when they wish to accept God's grace. So it's these principles and Augustine's ability to take the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and apply them to Christianity that had such an important influence on the world and the theologians and philosophers who came after him.